Nolan knelt in the center of the shattered dining room, a stolen combat knife loose in his grip, while blood pooled on the imported Italian marble, none of it his. For 2 years, the Hayes crime syndicate had dismissed him as the runt, the useless Omega, and the pity husband their Alpha took on to settle a dead man's debt. They had laughed when he walked into rooms, but they stopped laughing tonight. What they thought was a fragile doll had finally revealed itself to be a weapon. The church smelled of stale frankincense and expensive cologne. It was a cold Wednesday in November, the kind of day where the rain feels like needles against the skin. There were no flowers at the altar, no weeping relatives in the pews, just 30 armed men in tailored suits watching a transaction take place. Nolan Brooks stood at the front, swallowing the dry lump in his throat. His suit was a charcoal gray that hung a fraction too loose on his narrow frame. He didn't look like a mafia bride. He didn't look like much of anything. He was 22, but his eyes carried the hollowed-out exhaustion of a man twice his age. He was an Omega, technically, but his scent was muted, a faint trace of damp earth and old paper that was easily swallowed by the heavy, aggressive pheromones of the men in the room. Beside him stood Logan Hayes. Logan was an alpha who filled the space around him without trying. Broad shoulders, a jaw carved from granite, and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. He was the head of the Hayes Syndicate. He controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the city. He didn't need an Omega. He certainly didn't need Nolan. "Do you?" The priest droned, his voice trembling slightly under the weight of the audience. "Take this man." Nolan tuned it out. He knew why he was here. His father, Arthur Brooks, had run a mid-level smuggling operation that went under. Desperate, Arthur had stolen from the Hayes family, $1 million in untraceable cash. When Logan found out, Arthur was given a choice: a bullet in the head, or give up his only remaining asset to solidify a territorial claim. Nolan was the asset. A pawn moved across a bloody chessboard. "I do," Logan said. His voice was a low rumble, flat, devoid of any emotion. "I do," Nolan echoed, barely a whisper. Logan didn't kiss him. He just nodded to the priest, turned on his heel, and walked down the aisle. Nolan hurried a step behind him, head down, eyes on the scuffed heels of Logan's Oxford shoes. The reception was a quiet affair at a private restaurant downtown. Nolan sat at the head table, picking at a plate of cold risotto. Logan was flanked by his lieutenants, deep in conversation about shipping routes and bribes. They spoke over Nolan as if he were a piece of furniture. "But, boss, you sure about this?" The voice belonged to Leo, Logan's underboss, a burly alpha with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "The kid looks like a strong breeze would snap him in half. He can't even carry a scent properly. What good is an Omega who can't even calm an Alpha down?" Nolan kept his eyes on his fork. He took a small bite. The rice tasted like ash. "Arthur Brooks owned the warehouses on the east side," Logan replied, not looking at Nolan. He lit a cigarette, the sharp tang of tobacco masking the heavy musk of his Alpha scent. "The marriage transfers the deeds legally. No blood spilled. No cops asking questions. The kid is collateral, that's all." "Still," Leo scoffed, eyeing Nolan with open disdain. "Could have got a prettier piece of collateral." Nolan didn't flinch. He let the insult roll over him. Let them think what they wanted. Let them think he was weak, useless, invisible. Invisible men survive. That night, in the sprawling penthouse overlooking the city skyline, the reality of the arrangement settled in. Logan led Nolan to a guest bedroom down the hall from the master suite. The room was massive, sterile, and cold. "You sleep here," Logan said, standing in the doorway. He loosened his tie, looking at Nolan with a mixture of fatigue and mild irritation. "You have an allowance, a driver. You can go where you want during the day, provided Carter goes with you. Don't speak to the press. Don't embarrass the family." Nolan set his small duffel bag on the edge of the king-sized bed. "Are there restrictions on what I can read?" Logan paused, his brow furrowing. Of all the questions an Omega might ask on their wedding night, about mating, about safety, about money, that wasn't one of them. No, the library's downstairs. Knock yourself out. Thank you. Nolan didn't look at him. He just began unpacking his few shirts. Logan lingered for a second longer, perhaps waiting for a tear, a plea, or a sign of submission. When none came, he turned off the light. Good night, Nolan. Good night, Alpha. The door clicked shut. Nolan stood in the dark for a long time. He listened to the heavy retreating footsteps. He listened to the distant wail of a police siren. Then he walked to the window, staring out at the neon-soaked city. He rested his forehead against the cold glass, taking a slow, deep breath. Step 1 was complete. He was inside. 6 months passed. To the outside world, it was a quiet, unremarkable marriage. Inside the Hayes compound, a fortified estate on the edge of the city limits, it was a daily exercise in humiliation. The syndicate did not respect Nolan. In the hierarchy of the Mafia, strength was the only currency that mattered. Alphas ruled, Betas managed, and Omegas. Omegas were supposed to be soft, nurturing, and fiercely protected. They were status symbols. Nolan was none of those things. He was quiet, painfully thin, and completely unbothered by the aggressive posturing of the men around him. He spent his days in the estate's sprawling library or the solarium, surrounded by dusty hardcovers and neglected ferns. He wore oversized sweaters that hid his frame. He spoke only when spoken to. Carter, the Beta bodyguard assigned to him, made his contempt clear. "Car's ready," Carter snapped one Tuesday morning, leaning against the doorframe of the library. He was chewing gum loudly. "Make it quick today. I got a poker game at 4. Nolan carefully marked his page in a book on Russian history. He stood, smoothing down his sweater. "We're only going to the pharmacy and the tailor, Carter. We'll be back by 2. "Yeah, well, walk faster." In the kitchen, the disrespect was just as blatant. The cooks routinely ignored his requests for dietary changes. When he asked for tea, it came back lukewarm. The enforcers who patrolled the halls wouldn't step aside when he walked past, forcing Nolan to press his shoulders against the wall to squeeze by. He cataloged it all. Every slight, every routine. He knew that the guards changed shifts at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. He knew that the perimeter cameras had a 3-second blind spot in the northeast corner where the oak tree blocked the lens. He knew that Leo favored a Glock 19 worn on the right hip, but his draw was slow because he carried extra weight in his midsection. He knew Carter's left knee clicked when he walked upstairs, an old football injury that made him favor his right side. Logan, for his part, was a ghost, a phantom alpha who returned late at night smelling of cigar smoke, gunpowder, and exhaustion. The turf war with the Gallo brothers was escalating. Bodies were dropping in the streets. Logan was bleeding territory and men. They shared dinner once a week. It was a mandatory show of unity for the staff. They sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. The clinking of silverware was the only sound. "Leo says you went to the docks yesterday," Logan said abruptly, slicing into his steak. Nolan paused, resting his knife on the edge of his plate. "I wanted to see the water. Carter was with me. The docks aren't safe right now. The gallows hit a warehouse 2 miles from where you were standing." Logan looked up, his pale eyes pinning Nolan down. "I don't need the headache of my husband getting caught in a crossfire. Stay in the estate." "It's a gilded cage, Logan." Logan's jaw tightened. The air in the room grew heavy with the sudden spike of alpha pheromones, sharp, biting, like ozone before a lightning strike. "It's a safe cage. You're my responsibility. I made a deal with your father and I keep my word. You stay alive. That's the extent of our relationship." Nolan met his gaze. His own scent didn't spike in fear. It remained flat, neutral. "I understand perfectly." Logan scrutinized him for a long moment. There was something in the Alpha's expression, a flicker of confusion. Omegas were supposed to bare their throats to that kind of pressure. They were supposed to whine or seek comfort. Nolan just went back to cutting his chicken. You're a strange one, Nolan, Logan muttered, rubbing his temples. I'm exactly what you paid for, Nolan replied quietly. Later that week, the first crack in the facade appeared. Nolan was reading in the solarium. Carter was dozing in a chair by the door. Outside, the rain was lashing against the glass. A low-level enforcer named Briggs walked in, tracking mud on the Persian rug. He was drunk, a clear violation of estate rules, but with Logan out handling the war, discipline was slipping. Briggs spotted Nolan. He sneered, stumbling over. Hey, Runt, get me a beer. Nolan didn't look up from his book. The kitchen is down the hall. I told you to get it, you useless bitch. Briggs kicked the leg of Nolan's chair, hard. Carter jolted awake but didn't intervene. He just watched, a smirk playing on his lips. Nolan closed his book. He stood up slowly. He was a full head shorter than Briggs. The Alpha reeked of cheap whiskey and sour sweat. Briggs reached out, grabbing the collar of Nolan's sweater, pulling him close. You think 'cause you got a ring on your finger you're something? Briggs spat. Nolan's eyes went dead. The shift was instantaneous. The soft, submissive posture evaporated. His left hand shot up, his thumb pressing hard into the brachial plexus nerve bundle on Briggs's neck. At the same time, his right foot swept cleanly behind Briggs's ankle. It wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. Briggs collapsed with a choked gasp, his leg buckling. Before he hit the ground, Nolan twisted his wrist, applying a localized joint lock that forced the massive Alpha onto his stomach, face planted in the rug. Nolan placed a knee precisely on the back of Briggs's neck, not enough to break it, just enough to stop him from breathing if he moved an inch. Carter froze. His hand hovered over his holster, his jaw slack. Nolan looked up at the bodyguard. His voice was calm, unhurried. Carter, escort Mr. Briggs to his quarters. If he comes near me again, I will snap his collarbone. Do we have an understanding? Carter swallowed hard. Yeah. Nolan stepped off Briggs, smoothed his sweater, picked up his book, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. He knew he had slipped. He knew Carter would tell Leo, and Leo would tell Logan. But as he walked down the quiet hallway, Nolan flexed his fingers. His blood was humming. He had played the victim for 2 years to survive his father's house, and 6 months to survive his husband's. But the war was coming to their doorstep, and Nolan was tired of pretending. It happened on a Friday. Logan was supposed to be at a sit-down with the gallows to negotiate a ceasefire. It was a trap. Logan's convoy was ambushed on the interstate. Reports were frantic and fragmented. Leo was pinned down. Comms were jammed. But the gallows weren't just aiming for the king. They wanted to wipe the board. At 11:45 p.m., the power to the Hayes estate was cut. Nolan was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water. The sudden plunge into darkness was absolute. The low hum of the refrigerators died. Outside, the torrential rain muffled all sound. Nolan didn't freeze. He didn't gasp. He simply set the glass down on the counter. His breathing slowed. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Click. Phew. The sound of a suppressed gunshot in the front foyer. Nolan moved. He slid out of his slippers, stepping silently onto the hardwood floor in his socks. He pressed his back against the wall, inching toward the hallway. In the dim light cast by the lightning outside, he saw 2 bodies on the floor, the night shift guards. Dead. 4 men in tactical gear moved into the grand foyer. They wore night vision goggles and carried suppressed submachine guns. They moved with military precision, not street thugs, professional hitters. The gallows had hired outside help. "Sweep the ground floor," a harsh whisper echoed. "Find the Omega, put a bullet in his head, burn the rest." They split up. 2 headed toward the east wing. 2 moved toward the kitchen. Nolan retreated silently into the kitchen. He had 30 seconds. He bypassed the knife block on the counter. Too obvious they would look there. Instead, he opened the heavy pantry door and grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet and a jar of chili oil. He stood in the blind spot behind the swinging kitchen door. The door nudged open. The barrel of a gun breached the threshold. Then a boot. As the first assassin stepped in, sweeping the room with his weapon, Nolan struck. He brought the heavy cast iron skillet down, not on the man's head, but on his wrist. The bone shattered with a sickening crunch. The man opened his mouth to scream, but Nolan was already moving, driving the palm of his other hand upward into the man's chin, snapping his jaws shut and dropping him instantly. The second assassin heard the scuffle and rushed the door. Nolan threw the jar of chili oil hard against the door frame, right at face level. The glass shattered, spraying blinding, agonizing oil directly into the man's eyes beneath his goggles. The man shrieked, dropping his weapon to claw at his face. Nolan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, scooped the dropped combat knife from the first man's belt, and drove it precisely into the side of the second man's neck. He twisted, pulled it out, and let the body fall. 2 down, 2 left, plus whoever was waiting outside. Nolan picked up one of the suppressed SMGs. It was a SIG MPX. He checked the magazine. Full. He hadn't fired a gun in 3 years. His father had insisted on training him, not to protect himself, but to act as a hidden failsafe for their smuggling operations. "Nobody looks at the Omega," his father had said, right before striking him across the face for missing a target. Nolan exhaled. The scent of copper and voided bowels began to fill the kitchen. It smelled like his childhood. He slipped out the servants' entrance, moving into the shadowed corridor of the east wing. The lightning flashed, casting long, distorted shadows against the flocked wallpaper. He found the remaining 2 assassins in the library. They were kicking over bookshelves, looking for a hidden safe. Nolan didn't announce himself. He didn't give a dramatic speech. He raised the MPX, flipped the selector switch to single fire, and pulled the trigger twice. But 2 neat holes appeared in the side of the third man's head. He crumpled over a mahogany desk. The fourth man spun, firing wildly into the hallway. Wood splintered above Nolan's head as he dropped to a crouch, sliding across the polished floor. He returned fire, clipping the man in the knee. The assassin went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Nolan stood. He walked slowly into the library. The rain lashed against the tall windows. The assassin was clutching his ruined knee, his eyes wide behind his tactical mask, as he looked up at the slight sweater-clad figure standing over him. Who the fuck are you?" the man gasped. "I'm the husband," Nolan said softly. He raised the gun and finished it. Silence descended on the estate, save for the storm outside. Nolan dropped the empty magazine. He felt a strange sense of calm. The mask was off. The fragile, scentless Omega was dead. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the front entrance burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, shouting voices, alpha pheromones thick with panic, blood, and fury. Logan. He had survived the ambush. He burst into the foyer, his suit torn, blood streaming down the side of his face from a deep gash on his forehead. Leo and 3 other men were with him, weapons raised. "Nolan!" Logan roared. It was the first time Nolan had ever heard the Alpha sound terrified. The sheer force of the Alpha's distressed scent made the air vibrate. Logan stopped dead in his tracks. The beams of the flashlight settled on the center of the foyer. Nolan walked out of the shadows. He was barefoot. His hands were covered in blood. He held a bloodied combat knife in his left hand and an enemy's SMG in his right. Behind him, the bodies of the professional killers lay twisted on the imported Italian marble. Logan lowered his gun, his mouth parting in shock. He looked at the dead men. Then he looked at his husband. The useless, fragile Omega. Nolan looked back, his eyes cool and unreadable. He dropped the knife. It clattered loudly in the silent house. "You're late," Nolan said quietly. The cleanup crew arrived 20 minutes later. They were silent, efficient men in heavy rubber boots carrying industrial-grade bleach, thick plastic sheeting, and hacksaws. They moved around Nolan like he was a live wire. Word had already spread through the frantic whispered radios of the perimeter guards. The runt did it. The Brooks kid flatlined 4 professional hitters. Nolan sat at the massive kitchen island. He had washed his hands in the stainless steel sink, scrubbing the dried blood from under his fingernails with a harsh wire brush. He stared at a glass of water he still hadn't drank. Across the kitchen, Logan leaned heavily against the counter. A medic was finishing the stitches on his forehead, pulling the black thread taut. Logan didn't flinch. His eyes never left Nolan. The air in the room was thick, suffocatingly heavy with a cocktail of raw adrenaline, copper, and Logan's aggressive alpha scent. It tasted like burning cedar and ozone. Leo paced the length of the room. He looked like a caged dog. He kept glaring at the bodies being zipped into thick bags in the hallway, then back at Nolan. "This is a joke," Leo muttered, running a thick hand over his scarred face. "This is a setup. The gallows let them in, and he let them in. He's a rat." Nolan didn't blink. He slowly turned his head to look at the underboss. "If I were a rat, Leo, you would currently be dead in an ambush on the interstate, and the men in the hallway would be drinking Logan's scotch." Leo bristled, taking a step forward. "You watch your mouth, you little—" "Enough." Logan's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a physical weight that stopped Leo dead. The medic snipped the thread, packed his kit, and hurriedly exited the kitchen. Logan grabbed a towel, wiped the residual blood from his jaw, and walked over to the island. He sat across from Nolan. Up close, the exhaustion in the Mafia King's eyes was profound. The war was taking its toll. Yet, beneath the fatigue, there was a sharp, calculating focus. He was looking at his husband of 6 months as if he were a stranger. "My security system is state-of-the-art," Logan said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "The perimeter was breached. 2 guards dead. Power cut. Comms jammed. And 4 men who look like they eat gravel for breakfast come in to wipe out my home." Logan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the marble. "And you, a 22-year-old Omega who spends his days reading about the Romanovs, dismantled them with a cast-iron pan and a kitchen knife." "I also used a SIG MPX," Nolan corrected quietly. "Right. The SIG." Logan rubbed his face. "Arthur Brooks ran a mid-level smuggling ring. He was a coward who couldn't balance a ledger and stole from me to cover his gambling debts. So I ask you, Nolan, where the hell did you learn to snap a man's jaw with the palm of your hand?" Nolan looked down at his clean hands. He traced the lines on his palms. He had spent his entire life making himself small. It was a survival tactic. But the cage door was open now. There was no going back. "My father was a coward," Nolan agreed, his tone flat, entirely devoid of sentiment. "He was also paranoid. When you run illegal goods through the docks, you make enemies. He couldn't afford professional muscle, and he didn't trust the muscle he could afford." Nolan looked up, meeting Logan's bruised, pale eyes. "Alphas look at Omegas and see property," Nolan stated softly. "They see leverage. They see a target. But mostly, they see nothing. You stop paying attention the moment you categorize us as weak. My father knew that. So from the time I was 12, he hired disgraced military contractors to train me. Hand-to-hand combat, edged weapons, marksmanship, close-quarters tactical clearing." Leo scoffed loudly from the corner. "Bullshit. Arthur didn't have that kind of foresight. He didn't train me to be a soldier, Leo," Nolan said, his voice dropping a fraction, chilling the room. "He trained me to be a trap. I was the bait. I sat in the corner of his office during negotiations. I looked small. I looked frightened. And when the negotiations went south and the rival bosses pulled their weapons, they never checked the crying Omega in the corner." Silence hung in the kitchen, broken only by the distant rhythmic thud of the rain against the bulletproof glass. Logan stared at him. "You were an assassin for your father." "I was an insurance policy," Nolan corrected, "until his debts got too big and he realized he could use me to pay you off instead." Logan leaned back in his chair. The gears in his head were visibly turning. The man he had married, the fragile collateral he had locked away in a gilded cage to protect his own conscience, was a lie. The realization didn't bring anger. It brought something far more dangerous. It brought interest. "Why didn't you say anything?" Logan asked. "Why let my men treat you like garbage for 6 months?" "Survival requires adapting to your environment," Nolan replied. "You wanted a quiet, obedient Omega, so I gave you one. If I had shown you what I was, you would have seen me as a threat. You would have put a bullet in the back of my head." Logan's jaw tightened. "I don't shoot Omegas." "You shoot threats," Nolan said plainly. "Gender dynamics don't stop bullets, Logan." Logan stood up. He walked to the sink, poured a glass of water, and drank it in one long pull. He set the glass down with a heavy clack. "Carter is fired," Logan said to Leo. "If I see his face in this city again, cut his hands off. He fell asleep while an Omega handled a hit squad." "Boss," Leo started. "Do it," Logan snapped. He turned back to Nolan. The heavy, oppressive Alpha scent had shifted. It was no longer aggressive. It was grounded, focused. "The gallows crossed a line tonight," Logan said, his voice dropping an octave. "They went for my home. They went for my husband. Tomorrow, we stop playing defense." Logan looked at the blood on Nolan's sweater. "Get some sleep, Nolan. Tomorrow, you're not staying in the library." The basement of the Hayes estate was a reinforced concrete bunker designed to withstand a siege. It smelled of stale coffee, expensive tobacco, and unwashed men. The walls were lined with corkboards covered in satellite maps, shipping manifests, and photographs of the Gallo family hierarchy. It was 7 a.m. Nolan walked down the concrete stairs. He wore dark jeans, a fitted black long-sleeve Henley, and combat boots. No more oversized sweaters. He moved silently, his footsteps absorbed by the rubber soles. When he pushed open the heavy steel door, the conversation in the room abruptly died. 5 men sat around a heavy wooden table. Logan sat at the head. Leo was to his right. The others were capos, trusted lieutenants who ran the street-level operations. They all stared at Nolan as if a ghost had just walked into the room. "What's he doing down here?" asked Rossi, a grizzled beta with a missing earlobe. He looked at Logan for an explanation. "He's sitting in," Logan said. He didn't look up from the map spread across the table. "Pull up a chair, Nolan." Leo slammed his hands on the table. "Boss, with all due respect, this is a war council, not a tea party. I don't care what he did last night. This is our business." Nolan didn't wait for Logan to defend him. He walked over to an empty chair opposite Leo and pulled it out. He didn't sit. He leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the map. "Your business is currently losing," Nolan said, his tone conversational, as if commenting on the weather. "You lost the docks on 4th Street. You lost the transport route through the industrial park. And last night they almost took your head off on the interstate." Rossi stood up, his face flushing dark red. "You little piece of—" "Sit down, Rossi," Logan commanded. It was a quiet order, but the underlying growl made the hairs on the back of the men's necks stand up. Rossi slowly sat. Logan looked at Nolan. "You have an opinion on our strategy?" "You don't have a strategy," Nolan pointed out. "You're reacting. The gallows hit a target, you hit one back. They take a warehouse, you shoot up a club. It's an emotional response. They are dictating the pace of this war, and you're just dancing to their music." Leo laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And I suppose the Omega knows how to win a Mafia war? I know how to dismantle a structural hierarchy," Nolan replied. He reached across the table, grabbing a red marker. He walked over to the main corkboard. "The gallows operate on a decentralized financial model, but a centralized leadership structure," Nolan explained, drawing sharp, precise circles on the board. He was in his element. The shivering, silent boy from the altar was gone. "If we want to cripple them by Friday, we stop aiming for their soldiers. We hit their infrastructure simultaneously." Nolan began listing the targets, writing them rapidly on the whiteboard beside the map. Target acquisition. Operation Fracture. Target 1, the Lakeside Meatpacking Plant. Function, primary laundering front for their extortion rackets. Vulnerability, Heavy cash reserves on Tuesday nights. Minimal security. 4 guards. Target 2. Enzo Gallo's private accounting firm, downtown. Function: digital ledgers, political blackmail files. Vulnerability: physical servers located in the basement. Access requires a physical keycard, bypassing the firewall. Target 3, the South Point container yard. Function: weapons importation. Vulnerability: the shift change at 3 a.m. leaves the western gate blind for 12 minutes. The men in the room stared at the board in stunned silence. "How the hell do you know about the shift change at South Point?" Leo demanded, his suspicion flaring again. "Because I spent 6 months reading in the solarium while your guards bragged about their drinking buddies in the Gallo Syndicate," Nolan said dryly. "People don't lower their voices when an Omega is in the room. They treat us like we're deaf." Logan stared at the list. His eyes moved from the board to Nolan. There was a profound shift in the Alpha's gaze. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was deep, unadulterated respect. The kind of respect Logan rarely gave anyone. 3 targets, Logan mused, rubbing his jaw. Simultaneous strikes. It spreads us thin. It spreads them thinner, Nolan countered. You hit the meatpacking plant and the container yard with heavy ordnance, noise, fire. Make it look like a massive retaliation for last night. Draw Enzo Gallo's top enforcers out. And the accounting firm, Logan asked. A scalpel, not a hammer, Nolan said. A 2-man team goes in through the parking garage ventilation. Quiet. We bypass the main security, access the basement, rip the hard drives out of the servers, and leave before the Gallos even know they've been robbed. Without their blackmail files, their corrupt politicians will turn on them by morning to save their own skins. Logan nodded slowly. The plan was flawless. It was ruthless, efficient, and devastating. Leo, Logan ordered. You take a crew to the meatpacking plant, burn it to the studs. Rossi, you take South Point, sink every container they have into the harbor. And the servers? Leo asked, crossing his arms. Who's the scalpel? Logan stood up. He rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, revealing the thick, dark ink of his syndicate tattoos twisting up his forearms. I am, Logan said. You can't go in alone, boss, Rossi protested. He won't be, Nolan said quietly. Every eye snapped to him. Absolutely not, Logan said instantly. His alpha instinct flared, a sudden possessive wave of pheromones flooding the room. The scent was thick, heavy, demanding submission. You gave us the intel. You gave us the plan. You stay here where it's safe. Nolan didn't flinch beneath the pheromonal pressure. He met Logan's gaze evenly. I know the layout of the accounting firm. My father used their services before he went under. I know the ventilation shafts. I know where the server room is. You go in blind, you'll trigger a silent alarm and get boxed in by their quick response team. I am not taking my husband into a firefight, Logan growled, stepping closer to Nolan. I handled 4 of their best hitters in pajamas, Logan, Nolan replied, his voice calm, rational, and completely unyielding. I'm going. I'm not collateral anymore. They stared at each other. The tension crackled in the air, thick and electric. It was a clash of wills. An Alpha King used to absolute obedience, and an Omega who had spent his life forging his spirit in iron. Slowly, Logan exhaled. The heavy pheromones receded. Fine, Logan murmured, his voice rough. You're with me, but you follow my lead. I follow the tactical advantage, Nolan corrected softly. Logan actually smiled. It was a small, dangerous curving of his lips. Gear up, Nolan. We leave at midnight. The night was slick with freezing rain. The neon lights of the city reflected off the wet asphalt like spilled paint. Enzo Gallo's accounting firm was housed in a brutalist concrete building on the edge of the financial district. On paper, it was a legitimate enterprise. In reality, it was the nerve center of a criminal empire. Logan and Nolan crouched in the shadows of the adjacent alleyway. They were dressed in black tactical gear, suppressed Heckler and Koch USP tacticals holstered at their hips. Logan carried a short-barreled rifle slung across his chest. Nolan preferred to remain light. He had 2 combat knives strapped to his thighs and his sidearm. "See, Leo just initiated the strike on the meatpacking plant," Logan whispered, pressing an earpiece deeper into his ear. "Rossi is engaging at the docks. We have a 12-minute window before Gallo's Central Command realizes this building is the real target." Nolan nodded. He moved silently to the heavy steel grate covering a ventilation access port on the side of the building. He produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket. His hands were steady. 3 seconds later, the padlock clicked open. He pulled the grate aside. "Ladies first," Nolan whispered. Logan shot him a dry look but slid into the dark shaft. Nolan followed, pulling the grate shut behind them. The crawl was tight, smelling of dust and stagnant air. Nolan navigated by memory, guiding them through the maze of aluminum ductwork until they reached a vent overlooking the basement server room. Nolan peered through the slats. The room was bathed in the blue glow of massive server racks. 2 armed guards stood by the reinforced steel door, drinking coffee and watching a small television. 2 tangos, Nolan breathed, his lips barely an inch from Logan's ear. Logan shivered slightly at the proximity. The Omega's natural scent, which Nolan had suppressed for so long, was beginning to seep through the adrenaline. It was no longer damp earth. It was rain-washed pine and something sharp, like crushed mint. It was intoxicating. "I'll take the left, you take the right," Logan signaled with his hands. Nolan unscrewed the vent cover with agonizing slowness. He caught the metal grate before it could clang against the floor, setting it aside. They dropped from the ceiling in perfect synchronization. The soft thud of their boots hitting the linoleum made the guards turn, but they were entirely too slow. Logan stepped inside the first guard's guard, wrapping an arm around his throat and violently torquing his neck. A muffled crack, and the man went limp. Simultaneously, Nolan closed the distance to the second guard. The man went for his holster. Nolan didn't bother drawing his gun. He dropped low, sweeping a leg out to shatter the man's knee structure. As the guard collapsed forward with a choked cry, Nolan drove the hilt of his combat knife into the base of the man's skull. He caught the body before it hit the floor, lowering it silently. 4 seconds. Both threats neutralized. Logan looked at Nolan over the bodies. The Alpha's chest heaved slightly, his eyes blown wide, pupils dilated. Watching Nolan move was like watching water cut through rock. It was violent, beautiful, and utterly mesmerizing. "You're terrifying," Logan muttered, moving toward the server racks. "Focus, Alpha," Nolan replied, pulling a specialized hard drive extraction tool from his vest. They worked fast. Nolan bypassed the localized encryption protocol on the physical terminal, while Logan kept his rifle aimed at the steel door. The download bar on Nolan's portable drive crept agonizingly toward 100%. 80%. "We have a problem," Logan said softly. Nolan didn't look up from the screen. Define problem. Heavy footsteps, hallway, more than a standard patrol. 90%. "They must have been tipped off," Nolan said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Or the Central Command figured out the diversion faster than anticipated." 95%. The heavy steel door suddenly groaned as a keycard swiped on the outside. "Get back!" Logan barked, raising his rifle. The door burst open. 4 heavily armed Gallo enforcers poured into the server room, assault rifles raised. The basement erupted into deafening gunfire. Logan fired in controlled bursts, dropping the first man through the door. But the sheer volume of return fire forced him to dive behind a massive server rack. Bullets chewed through the metal casing above his head, showering him in sparks and shredded plastic. "Pin him down!" A voice roared from the hallway. 100%. Nolan yanked the drive from the console and shoved it into his tactical vest. He was crouched behind the terminal desk, 20 feet from Logan. The Alpha was pinned. If he leaned out, he'd be cut in half. Nolan drew his suppressed USP. He took a breath. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. He didn't pop up from behind the desk. That was predictable. Instead, he slid violently across the smooth linoleum floor, emerging from the side of the desk at ground level. He fired 3 times rapidly. The shots were whisper quiet beneath the roar of the enemy rifles. 2 men dropped, shot precisely in the gaps of their body armor. 1 in the throat, 1 in the femoral artery. The remaining enforcer panicked. He spun toward Nolan, his rifle swinging wildly. It gave Logan the fraction of a second he needed. The Alpha lunged from cover, driving his shoulder into the enforcer's chest, slamming him against the concrete wall with bone-shattering force. Logan drove a heavy fist into the man's face, once, twice, dropping him to the floor. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the hum of the surviving servers and the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 men. Logan leaned against the wall, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek. He looked across the ruined room at his husband. Nolan stood up slowly. He holstered his weapon. His face was pale in the blue light, but his hands were perfectly steady. He patted the pocket of his vest. "We have the files," Nolan said. Logan walked slowly toward him. The Alpha pheromones in the room were dizzying now, thick with adrenaline, protectiveness, and raw, unfiltered awe. He stopped inches from Nolan. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping Nolan's jaw. It was the first time Logan had touched him with genuine care since the day they met at the altar. Nolan's breath hitched slightly. He didn't pull away. "You saved my life," Logan rasped, his thumb brushing over a smudge of soot on Nolan's cheek. "We had a deal," Nolan whispered, staring up into the bruised winter sky of Logan's eyes. "I stay alive. You stay alive." Logan's gaze dropped to Nolan's lips for a fraction of a second. "I think the terms of our arrangement have fundamentally changed." "I think," Nolan said, a ghost of a smirk touching his mouth, "we should get the hell out of here before Enzo Gallo sends the rest of his army." Logan laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed in the bloody server room. "Lead the way, husband." Dawn broke over the city in streaks of bruised purple and dull gray. The Hayes estate was no longer a silent mausoleum. It was a fortress buzzing with the frantic energy of men who had just tasted blood and wanted more. Trucks idled in the driveway. Enforcers carrying rifles patrolled the perimeter in pairs. The scent of ozone, exhaust, and stale adrenaline hung thick in the damp morning air. Logan's black SUV pulled through the wrought iron gates. The tires crunched over the gravel, coming to a halt near the front steps. When Logan stepped out, the men in the courtyard straightened. They looked at their Alpha, noting the soot on his face, the tear in his tactical vest, and the unreadable hardness in his pale eyes. Then the passenger door opened. Nolan stepped out. He moved a little slower than usual. There was a shallow graze on his left bicep, where a stray piece of shrapnel had torn through his Henley, the fabric stiff with dried blood. His hands were dark with grime, but his posture was flawless, spine straight, chin level. The courtyard went dead silent. Every eye locked onto the Omega. Word had already spread from the basement war room. The men knew the strategy came from the runt. They knew the untouchable Gallo servers had been breached by the fragile kid who usually sat in the solarium. But seeing him now, walking shoulder to shoulder with Logan, radiating a terrifying, icy calm, it shattered the last remnants of their prejudice. Leo was waiting in the foyer. The underboss smelled of smoke and cheap gasoline. His knuckles were raw. The meatpacking plant had burned beautifully. Leo looked at Logan, then shifted his gaze to Nolan. The burly Alpha swallowed hard. He stepped forward and did something nobody in the Hayes Syndicate had ever seen him do. He lowered his head, baring his throat slightly in a universal sign of deference. "We took the plant, boss," Leo rumbled, his eyes fixed firmly on Nolan's boots. "Rossi sank the containers at South Point. The Gallows are bleeding out from a dozen arteries." Nolan pulled the encrypted hard drive from his vest. He tossed it lightly. Leo caught it with clumsy, startled hands. "Get this to the tech team," Nolan said, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly through the grand hall. I want the ledgers decrypted by noon. Sort the politicians by their bribe amounts. Send the top earners copies of their own files with a polite suggestion to freeze all Gallo assets immediately. If they refuse, we leak the files to the feds. Leo didn't look at Logan for confirmation. He just nodded. Yes, sir. Logan watched the exchange. A deep, territorial rumble vibrated in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, possessive pride. His Omega was giving orders to his underboss, and the underboss was submitting. Clean up, Logan ordered the room. We reconvene in 2 hours. He placed a heavy hand on the small of Nolan's back. The touch was light, but the heat of it seared through Nolan's shirt. Logan guided him upstairs, past the shattered marble of the dining room, where the cleanup crew had finally scrubbed away the blood of the hit squad. They didn't go to Nolan's sterile guest room. Logan steered them into the master suite. The room was vast, dominated by a massive 4-poster bed and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Logan locked the heavy oak door behind them. The click echoed loudly. Suddenly, the adrenaline of the night evaporated, leaving a crushing exhaustion in its wake. Nolan swayed slightly. His knees felt like water. Before he could reach out to steady himself against the mahogany dresser, Logan was there. The Alpha caught him, wrapping strong arms around his waist. "I've got you," Logan murmured. His voice was stripped of the cold authority he used with his men. It was raw, intimate. Logan guided Nolan to the edge of the bed, pressing him down gently. He knelt on the floor in front of him, reaching for the hem of Nolan's ruined Henley. "Lift your arms." Nolan complied silently. The shirt was pulled over his head and tossed aside. The cold air of the bedroom hit his bare skin. He was thin, yes, but not fragile. His torso was corded with lean, compact muscle and marked by a constellation of faded, jagged scars, souvenirs from his father's brutal training regime. Logan traced a particularly nasty scar over Nolan's ribs with the pad of his thumb. His jaw clenched. "I thought I was buying a victim," Logan said softly, his eyes dark. "I thought I was doing Arthur Brooks a favor by taking his abused son out of his house. I had no idea I was locking a weapon in a cage." Logan moved to the ensuite bathroom and returned with a first aid kit and a warm, wet towel. He began to clean the shrapnel graze on Nolan's arm. His touch was painstakingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence they had just orchestrated. "I'm not a victim, Logan," Nolan replied. He watched the Alpha's dark hair fall over his forehead as he worked. "But I wasn't a weapon by choice. You survived the hand you're dealt." "You don't have to survive anymore," Logan said. He looked up, his bruised sky eyes pinning Nolan in place. The heavy scent of burning cedar and ozone wrapped around Nolan, but it wasn't suffocating. It was a shield. "You're my husband, not my collateral, not my prisoner. I failed you for 6 months because I didn't bother to look past the surface. That ends today." Nolan's breath hitched. For 10 years he had kept his heart encased in ice. He had measured every word, calculated every footstep, suppressed his own scent to the point of near non-existence. But looking at Logan now, a ruthless Mafia king kneeling on the floor to bandage a scrape on an Omega's arm, the ice began to crack. A new scent began to fill the room. It slipped past Nolan's iron control. Rain-washed pine, crushed mint, a hint of something sweet and deeply mourning. Logan inhaled sharply. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The biological response was immediate, an alpha recognizing their mate. Logan leaned forward, pressing his face into the curve of Nolan's neck, right over his scent gland. He didn't bite. He just breathed him in, a long, shuddering inhalation that made Logan's broad shoulders tremble. "Nolan," Logan breathed against his skin. Nolan closed his eyes. He slowly raised his hands, burying his fingers in Logan's thick hair. He let his head fall back, exposing his throat entirely. It was the ultimate gesture of Omega submission, but there was no fear in it. Only trust. We have a war to finish, Nolan whispered into the quiet room. Let it wait a few hours, Logan rasped, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Nolan's collarbone. They didn't consummate it. The timing wasn't right. The blood was too fresh. But as they lay back on the heavy duvet, fully clothed except for Nolan's shirt, tangled together in the gray morning light, a boundary was permanently crossed. They slept, breathing in the scent of cedar and pine, two killers finally finding rest in the dark. 48 hours later, Enzo Gallo's empire was a burning shipwreck. The strategy was brutally effective. The leaked ledgers paralyzed Gallo's political protection. The police, suddenly free from their corrupt masters, raided 3 of Gallo's illicit casinos in a single night to make a public show of force. The streets belonged to the Hayes Syndicate. Enzo Gallo was hemorrhaging money, men, and territory. He was backed into a corner, and cornered rats are always the most dangerous. The message arrived on a Thursday evening. It was delivered by a terrified neutral courier who stood shaking in the Hayes courtyard. Logan read the handwritten note at the kitchen island. Nolan stood beside him, sipping a cup of black tea. He wants a sit-down, Logan said, tossing the heavy cardstock onto the marble counter. Tonight. Midnight. The old rail yard out in the Barrens. Leo snorted from his position by the refrigerator. It's a trap. The Barrens is a ghost town. Plenty of high ground for snipers. Plenty of blind corners. He goes in, he doesn't come out. It's absolutely a trap, Nolan agreed. He set his teacup down. The porcelain clinked sharply. Enzo has lost his infrastructure. He can't win a prolonged war of attrition anymore. His only play is to cut off the head of the snake and hope the body dies. He's going to put every gun he has left into that rail yard. So we tell him to go to hell, Rossi suggested, crossing his arms. We wait him out. He'll bleed to death on his own. No, Logan said. He looked at Nolan. The silent communication between them was instantaneous and profound. They had spent the last 2 days locked in the war room together, anticipating this exact move. If we wait, he slinks away. He regroups. He strikes again in 6 months. Nolan explained quietly. We end it tonight. We walk into the trap, and we spring it on him. The plan they formulated was a masterpiece of lethal misdirection. At 11:30 p.m., a convoy of 3 armored black SUVs departed the Hayes estate. They drove through the rain-slicked streets, leaving the neon glow of the city behind and entering the desolate, sprawling, rust-belt decay of the Barrens. The rail yard was a rusted graveyard of hollowed-out train cars and collapsing brick warehouses. The moonlight struggled to pierce the heavy cloud cover. Logan's convoy parked at the edge of the central clearing. Logan stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a long wool overcoat that concealed the heavy body armor and the short-barreled rifle strapped to his side. 6 of his best men fanned out around him, their boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Enzo Gallo was already waiting. The rival boss stood beneath the flickering yellow light of a solitary, dying street lamp. He looked haggard. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his eyes were bloodshot, darting nervously around the shadows. He was flanked by 12 men. These weren't street thugs. They wore matching tactical gear, mercenaries, expensive ones. "Logan!" Enzo called out. His voice cracked slightly. He tried to project authority, but the pheromones rolling off him reeked of sour fear and desperation. Logan stopped 20 paces away. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the older Alpha with the cold, dead eyes of an executioner. "You burned my city," Enzo spat, stepping forward. "You stole my ledgers. You turned my own pocket cops against me." "You sent men into my home, Enzo," Logan said. His voice was a low rumble that carried effortlessly through the damp air. "You aimed at my husband. The city was just the price you paid for the insult." Enzo laughed harshly. "Your husband? The little Omega runt? That's what this is about? You tore up the treaty over a piece of tail?" "He's not a piece of tail," Logan said. A grim, terrifying smile touched the corner of his mouth. "He's the architect of your ruin." Enzo's face twisted in rage. He raised his hand. "Kill him. Kill them all." The mercenaries raised their rifles, but Logan's men didn't even flinch. They didn't raise their weapons to return fire. They just stood there, because before a single mercenary could pull a trigger, the shadows above them exploded. Nolan hadn't ridden in the SUVs. He had left the estate 3 hours earlier, alone, dressed in matte black from head to toe. He had scaled the rusted scaffolding of the crumbling warehouse overlooking the central clearing, planting himself directly behind the Gallo firing line. As Enzo dropped his hand, Nolan opened fire with a suppressed designated marksman rifle. Foot, foot, foot. The 3 mercenaries closest to Enzo collapsed simultaneously, their heads snapping back as high-velocity rounds pierced their helmets. Panic erupted. The remaining mercenaries broke formation, spinning frantically to find the shooter in the pitch-black scaffolding above. "Now!" Logan roared. Logan and his men drew their weapons and charged. The clearing devolved into absolute chaos. The roar of unsilenced automatic gunfire shattered the night. The flash of muzzle flares illuminated the rusted train cars in strobes of hellish orange light. Enzo shrieked, scrambling backward behind a rusted cargo container as his expensive mercenaries were caught in a brutal crossfire. They were pinned between Logan's frontal assault and Nolan's devastating pinpoint accuracy from above. Nolan dropped the rifle when the magazine ran dry. He didn't bother reloading. He drew his combat knives and vaulted over the rusted railing, dropping 15 feet onto the roof of a train car. He landed in a silent crouch, absorbing the impact, and dropped down into the fray. A mercenary rounded the corner of the train car, rifle raised. Nolan didn't stop moving. He slipped under the barrel of the gun, driving his left blade upward into the soft gap under the man's armpit, piercing the lung. As the man gasped, Nolan dragged the right blade across his throat. He moved through the smoke and the gunfire like a ghost. He was entirely disconnected from the noise. His breathing was steady. His heart rate was a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. He was looking for Enzo. He found him dragging himself through the mud toward a running, unmarked sedan parked near the perimeter fence. Enzo's leg was bleeding heavily from a stray ricochet. Nolan stepped out from behind a rusted iron pillar, blocking the path. Enzo froze. He looked up at the slender, blood-spattered Omega standing in his way. The street lamp cast harsh shadows over Nolan's face. His eyes were utterly devoid of pity. "You!" Enzo gasped, fumbling for the revolver at his hip. Nolan didn't shoot him. He took 2 rapid steps forward and kicked the heavy revolver out of Enzo's trembling hand. The gun clattered away into the darkness. Enzo scrambled backward, his hands held up in surrender. Wait. I have money. Offshore accounts. Tens of millions. I can transfer it right now." Nolan tilted his head. He looked down at the pathetic, broken Alpha. "You don't understand the currency we deal in, Enzo," Nolan said softly. Footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel behind them. Logan emerged from the smoke. His overcoat was torn, his face smeared with grease and blood. He held his rifle at his side. The firefight had died down. The mercenaries were dead or fleeing. Logan walked up and stood shoulder to shoulder with Nolan. He looked down at Enzo Gallo. "Please," Enzo begged, looking between the Alpha King and the Omega Executioner. "Mercy." Logan looked at Nolan. The silent question hung in the air. "Yours or mine?" Nolan met Logan's gaze. The bond between them flared, sharp and resonant. Nolan gave a fractional nod. He insulted the Alpha. "The Alpha takes the head." Logan raised his rifle. He didn't blink. "For my husband," Logan said. He pulled the trigger. The rain finally stopped. The cleanup crew wouldn't be called to the barrens. Let the cops find the bodies. Let the rival families across the state read the headlines. The message needed to be loud and unmistakable. The Hayes Syndicate was not to be touched. Back at the estate, the mood was subdued but electric. It wasn't the raucous celebration of a street gang. It was the quiet, terrifying consolidation of absolute power. Leo, Rossi, and the capos stood in the grand foyer. They watched as Logan and Nolan walked through the heavy oak doors. They were covered in mud, cordite, and blood. They looked like creatures dragged from the depths of a nightmare, and yet no one dared to look away. Leo stepped forward. He didn't bow his head this time. He dropped to one knee on the marble floor. It was an ancient, antiquated gesture in the modern mafia. It was reserved for the crowning of a new dawn. Rossi followed. Then the capos. One by one, the hardened killers of the Hayes Syndicate knelt. They weren't just kneeling to Logan, they were kneeling to the Omega standing flawlessly at his side. Logan looked at his men. Then he looked at Nolan. "Stand up," Logan commanded. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The men rose. "The Gallo territory is ours," Logan said smoothly. "Leo, you absorb their remaining rackets. Rossi, you lock down their supply lines. If anyone pushes back, remind them what happened in the Barrens tonight." The capos dispersed rapidly, eager to carve up the spoils of war. The foyer emptied, leaving only Logan and Nolan standing amidst the quiet luxury of the estate. The silence was absolute. Logan dropped his rifle on a side table. He stripped off the heavy, ruined overcoat, letting it fall to the floor. He turned to Nolan. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the primal, undeniable pull of the mating bond. Nolan sheathed his knives. He looked up at Logan. The ice was entirely gone from the Omega's eyes. In its place was a fierce, burning devotion. Logan stepped into Nolan's space. He didn't ask this time. He wrapped his arms around Nolan's waist and lifted him off his feet, pressing him against the heavy oak door. Nolan gasped as Logan's mouth crashed down on his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was bruising, desperate, tasting of copper and rain. It was a collision of two souls who had survived the dark by turning themselves into monsters, only to find salvation in each other. Nolan wrapped his legs around Logan's hips, his fingers digging desperately into Logan's shoulders. He opened his mouth, letting Logan's tongue map the inside, a complete surrender of control that he had never granted to anyone in his entire life. Logan tore his mouth away, gasping for air. His eyes were black, his fangs fully descended. The alpha instinct was screaming at him to claim, to mark, to bind this terrifying, beautiful creature to him for eternity. "Mine," Logan growled, his voice vibrating against Nolan's chest. "Yours," Nolan confirmed breathlessly. He bared his neck, tilting his head back to expose the pale, unblemished skin over his scent gland. "Claim me, Logan." Logan didn't hesitate. He buried his face in Nolan's neck and bit down hard. Nolan cried out, his back arching sharply against the door as Logan's fangs pierced his flesh. The pain was sharp, blinding, but it was instantly swallowed by a tidal wave of warmth. The chemical rush of the mating bond flooded their systems, permanently entwining their scents, their minds, their lives. Burning cedar, rain-washed pine, ozone, and crushed mint. Logan held him tight as the initial shock subsided, licking the twin drops of blood from the fresh mark. He rested his forehead against Nolan's, their chests heaving in unison. "King and consort," Logan whispered, his thumb tracing the jawline of his newly mated Omega. Nolan smiled. It was a genuine, breathtaking smile that reached his eyes, fundamentally changing his face. The hollowed-out boy from the altar was dead. The assassin was asleep. "Just a husband, Logan," Nolan corrected softly. "I think you'll find that's dangerous enough." Logan chuckled, the sound deep and rich in the quiet hall. He carried Nolan away from the door, walking up the sweeping staircase toward the master suite. The war was over. The city belonged to the Hayes family. The rivals who had mocked the weak, useless Omega would whisper his name in terror for generations. They would tell the story of the fragile pawn who was handed to a monster, only to realize the pawn was the most dangerous piece on the board. In the criminal underworld, survival belongs to the strongest, but true power belongs to the one you never see coming. That concludes the story of Nolan and Logan, a marriage forged in cold blood that ultimately burned a rival criminal empire to ashes. The underworld learned a brutal, unforgettable lesson. Never underestimate the quiet one in the corner, especially when he's the mated Omega of a mafia king. If you loved watching Nolan shatter every cliché and dismantle the Gallo Syndicate, With ruthless precision, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more dark, grounded Omegaverse audio dramas. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, and drop a comment below. What was your favorite tactical takedown? Share this video with your friends, and we'll see you next time.